Welcome to the National EMS Academy's online EMT lesson on pathophysiology. Pathophysiology is the study of how normal physiological processes are affected by injury and illness. This is a somewhat complex topic, and I've divided it into 5 different lessons to keep things a little more brief and concise. This is part 1 of that 5-part series. Let's get started. Now, when most of us think of injury or disease, we tend to define them based on the organ affected. For example, people have heart attacks. They have strokes. In traumatic situations, we worry about injuries to the bones or lungs or whatever. That's okay, but in reality, all of these affect the body at the cellular level. And believe it or not, there are a lot of similarities in those effects regardless of the organ in question. My goal in this class is to help you understand these effects. Now let's start off with a basic review of cell theory. Cell theory says that our bodies are composed of millions of cells. Different cell types are arranged in such a way to make up tissues and organs. When an organ is ill or injured, the damage is actually occurring at the cellular level. If enough cells are damaged, then the organ is not going to work very well. And when organs don't work very well, we run the risks of the organism, i.e. you, me, or our patients, will die. Now, all cells have a job. It might be a really cool job that gets a lot of attention. For example, brain cells carry important nervous impulses. The heart's muscle cells beat in unison with all the others to pump blood throughout our bodies. There are other cells that might not get so much attention, like skin cells and butt cells and whatever, but they all have a job to do. Now, to do that job, just like you and I, they need energy. No energy equals no work. No work equals potential organ failure. And organ failure can end in death. In this section, we'll discuss how cells access energy, and I want you to note how these bigger systems we think about, like breathing, actually occur to support this cellular function. Okay, now I know it doesn't look like much, but this is a cell. Or more accurately, it's going to serve as a simple model so that I can explain some of the more complicated cellular physiology. Hopefully some of that info I provided back in the A&P section stuck with you because we're going to be using it here. First, cells have a lot of parts in them, but in this lesson we're only going to focus on one. It's called the mitochondria. And without it, the cell can't produce much energy. Here's the mitochondria in this particular cell. Now, recall that the respiratory system delivers oxygen to the blood, and the cardiovascular system transports that blood to the cells. Here's a blood vessel, and here's the oxygen leaving that blood vessel and entering the cell. Once it's in the cell, it travels to the mitochondria. The circulatory system also delivers nutrients that were absorbed in the digestive system, and these are carried by the cardiovascular system to the cells as well. Now, there are a lot of different nutrients, but when it comes to making energy, our cells love what are called simple sugars. Stuff like glucose and dextrose. And that's what we're going to focus on in this lesson. Now, these sugars have a very similar molecular structure. Now, don't freak, it's not that complicated. That structure is what we call a 6-carbon chain. Here I'm going to draw one. Now, there are other atoms attached to this, but this simple chain will suffice to explain this process. Now, something really interesting happens when this sugar molecule passes through the cell membrane and enters the cells. It breaks in half. And when it does, the chemical bond that was holding it together provides the cell with a little bit of energy, which is stored as 2 units of ATP. ATP is how cells store energy. Think of it like the gas in your car's tank. Now, there are a couple things here that you need to know. First, these 2 3-carbon molecules are called pyruvic acid. That's right, they're an acid, and if too much builds up, that can affect acid-base balance, and you should remember from the A&P section that that's bad. Second, this simple reaction occurs without the use of oxygen, so it's called anaerobic metabolism, another term you hopefully remember from before. Okay, now moving on. Now these 2 guys are going to move into the mitochondria where they will undergo further chemical reactions that use oxygen that entered earlier. These reactions are called Krebs cycle and electron transport, but that's not really important. What's important is this. First, we're using oxygen, so this is a process called aerobic metabolism. Second, these reactions create 32 units of ATP, and that's a lot more than what we got initially in that first step. So what are the takeaway lessons here? First, if we lose the oxygen, like when a patient becomes hypoxic and there's inadequate O2 being delivered to the cells, only this first reaction can occur. So cells make a little energy, but not enough to function very long. Second, that pyruvic acid cannot undergo the chemical reactions in the mitochondria without oxygen, so it builds up and causes acidosis. Third, we never make these 38 molecules of ATP, so again, we're going to run out of energy. Oh yeah, one more thing you might find interesting. When these reactions are occurring in the mitochondria, those chemical bonds that hold the carbons together are broken, and this results in free carbon atoms. Those carbon atoms hook up with the oxygen to form carbon dioxide. That's why we breathe in oxygen and breathe out carbon dioxide. Now we'll wrap up this lesson with a little more discussion on why cells need energy. I mentioned earlier that it's necessary to do its job. For example, muscles contract, sperm swim, those kind of things. But in this case, I'm going to use this neuron or nerve cell to help me explain the jobs. First, nerve cells transmit electrical impulses to other areas of the body. So this neuron would pick up a signal over here on the right, and then it's going to move it through the cell all the way to the other end. So job 1 is impulse transmission if you're a neuron, and that requires energy. But all cells have another job. That is, they have to maintain the proper chemical environment to remain healthy, and that also requires energy. And here is one of the most important of these tasks that they have to do. The chemical elements that enter our body will naturally try to spread out evenly. That's due to diffusion. For example, if there's sodium out here, it's going to try to migrate into the cell until the concentrations are equal inside and outside the cell. Potassium is also around here, so it's going to try to do the same thing. Unfortunately, there are some things the cell needs to keep out and others that it needs to keep in. For example, our cells like to keep the sodium out and the potassium in. They do this with special pumps that actually pump the sodium out and the potassium in, and these pumps require energy. So when energy runs out, the pumps stop. When the pump stops, sodium rushes into the cell, and water always follows sodium. When the water enters, it causes the cells to swell, and eventually the cell membrane ruptures and it kills the cell. So there you go. Our cells need energy to fuel the processes that let them do their job and to maintain a stable chemical environment. That's it for this lesson. Next time we're going to cover the interaction between the respiratory and circulatory system that helps keep these cells supplied with oxygen and removes the carbon dioxide. See you next time.